July 17, 1986. Altitude 36,000 feet. Course steady north-northeast. The aircraft was a twin-engine Boeing 720B operated by a West European charter line en route from Helsinki to Murmansk, with 62 passengers aboard, mostly business travelers, 2 diplomats, and a crew unaware of the sky they were entering. What they didn't know, what no one on the plane knew, was that a slight autopilot deviation had pushed them nearly 70 kilometers off their intended flight corridor. And now, they were heading straight toward the Soviet Union's most heavily restricted air corridor zone, 12B. Officially, Zone 12B didn't exist. It was a blacked-out segment of airspace nestled between Arkhangelsk and a classified missile tracking station buried in the forests of Severodvinsk. It was defended by a layered system of radar, S-200 SAM sites, and MiG-ready airfields. At 10:46 a.m. local time, radar operators at a Soviet command post near Mezin picked up the aircraft. No IFF signature, no flight path on record, no warning, and the first report to command was short. Unknown aircraft. Altitude 11,000 meters. Entering restricted air corridor. Protocol kicked in. By 10:48, MiG-23s were scrambled from Monchegorsk Air Base. Interceptor teams were told to visually identify, shadow, and await confirmation from Moscow. But confirmation never came. Inside the radar room, one officer quietly asked what no one else dared, "Are we about to shoot down an airliner?" No one answered, because they didn't know. The aircraft didn't change course. It didn't respond to Soviet hails. It didn't squawk civilian emergency codes. And yet, it wasn't acting like a spy plane either. No evasive maneuvers, no erratic movement, just steady flight right into the heart of a launch corridor built for war. Not mistakes. For 7 minutes. Soviet air defense systems locked onto a target they could not identify but could destroy at any moment. The pilots of the MiGs held formation at a distance, awaiting the next order, and the radar room froze because they had the missiles. They had the target, but they didn't have the certainty. And in a system built on firing fast, that hesitation was the most dangerous anomaly of all in every Soviet air defense command room. Assumptions were not just embedded in doctrine, they were built into the architecture of escalation itself. Assumption 1. No civilian aircraft would ever drift into a closed military corridor. The Soviet Union maintained tight control over international air routes, working closely with neutral and allied aviation authorities. Civilian traffic was herded along predefined corridors, red routes, green lanes, each bounded by buffer zones at least 40 kilometers wide. Civilian pilots were expected to stick to the script, and if they didn't, the belief was simple. Their onboard systems, or their national ATC partners, would correct them long before they became a problem. Assumption 2. If a bogey entered restricted airspace, it was hostile. By the 1980s, Soviet airspace had been violated dozens of times by American RC-135s, U-2s, British Canberras, even unmanned drones. The assumption was that if something unidentified entered a military zone, it wasn't lost, it was probing. Every radar echo not accounted for was a CIA sensor, a NATO test, or an opening salvo in a broader psychological operation. Assumption 3. The system would catch the mistake before it mattered. Radar teams, interceptor pilots, missile crews, they all trained under a vertical doctrine. There would be warnings, chain of command communication, human eyes verifying every anomaly, and above all, someone up top who would know what was happening. But on this day, every assumption broke. The civilian airliner was on a legal flight plan, Helsinki to Murmansk, filed, cleared, and coordinated. But at waypoint 33B, the autopilot failed to compensate for a crosswind drift. In just under 15 minutes, the aircraft had entered the southern fringe of a restricted arc it was never meant to be near. The airliner's transponder was active, but Soviet radar stations didn't have full compatibility with the Western civilian beacon system. To them, the aircraft looked like an untagged target, technically visible, but unaccounted for. No intercept request had been sent from civilian controllers, no emergency beacon, no distress code, and so the system defaulted to what it was built to do: detect, lock, prepare to destroy. But in the command center, something strange happened. The radar crew didn't shout. They didn't panic. They slowed. Officers stared at the screen, at the steady green blip perfect speed. Perfect altitude. Not military, not aggressive, just wrong. And yet, because it wasn't in the doctrine, they didn't know how to respond. One officer muttered, "It doesn't make sense." Another scribbled a report for review marked urgent, but unsigned. A colonel picked up the phone to call regional command, only to be told we're already tracking it, awaiting Moscow. In a war built on response times measured in seconds, the Soviet command structure began waiting, watching, frozen not by indecision, but by a system that didn't allow for error without enemy. Soviet air defense was not built for ambiguity. It was designed for velocity. From the moment a radar blip appeared to the instant a surface-to-air missile launched, every second was scripted. Every decision point was framed in absolutes: target or no target, friend or foe, engage or abort. The backbone of this machinery was PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, its network of early warning radars, interceptor bases, and command posts stretched across 11 time zones. Thousands of officers manned consoles 24/7, primed for the moment NATO or the U.S. crossed the line, and within that system, the doctrine was clear. Unidentified aircraft entering zones of strategic significance like Zone 12B triggered a graduated escalation protocol: detect and classify. Is the object transmitting IFF? Is it following a known flight path? Contact and warn. Send interceptors to signal a course correction. Flashlights, roll wings, force or fire. If the aircraft ignores all commands and enters a critical zone, escalate to force down. If non-compliant, destroy. It sounded rational, linear, but it had one fatal assumption: that any aircraft not complying with Soviet procedure must be doing so on purpose. There was no provision for a lost plane, no real training for civilian navigational errors, no pathway for saying, "This might just be a mistake." Doctrine didn't permit that kind of uncertainty. Even worse, the decision authority was scattered. Tactical orders came from theater command, but full engagement in a restricted zone, especially one near nuclear infrastructure, required authorization from 2 levels up. And that delay was a feature, not a bug. It was meant to prevent accidental war. But when a non-hostile aircraft appeared, that lag time transformed into paralysis. At 10:51, the MiG-23s had visual contact. They radioed, "Target is twin-engine jet. Civilian model, no military markings, no evasive action." What followed was silence. The pilots asked, "Do we engage?" Ground control responded, "Awaiting Moscow." The radar post asked, "Are we sure it's not a reconnaissance craft?" Command replied, "Treat it as threat until proven otherwise." But proof wasn't coming, because the doctrine didn't allow for a maybe. It demanded answers, but offered no tools to find them. And so, faced with a scenario not covered in any manual, the Soviet air defense system stalled, caught in a recursive loop of escalating readiness and uncertain authority. Ironically, the system wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was built to do. And that was the problem. At 10:53 a.m., the civilian jetliner breached the inner perimeter of Zone 12B to Soviet radar operators. This was more than an unauthorized crossing. It was an impossible event. No commercial aircraft, they believed, would ever drift into a space so secret, so controlled, so forbidden. The MiG-23s flanked the airliner, holding close for visual. The lead interceptor pilot transmitted a description, registration unreadable, civilian configuration, Boeing type, engines nominal, no deviation, altitude 11,000 meters. The jet wasn't trying to flee, it wasn't signaling distress, it just flew calmly, obliviously, deeper into the no-fly zone. Ground control expected something to change, a course correction, a sudden dive, a radio call, but nothing came. Inside the command post near Arkhangelsk, officers realized what they were witnessing, a commercial aircraft flying directly above a classified missile telemetry site, carrying who knew what kind of equipment or intent. Could it be masking a spy probe? Was it a Trojan horse, transmitting surveillance data back to NATO? Was this a test of Soviet perimeter response? No one could say. And no one was willing to be wrong. By 10:55, SAM units were placed on full combat alert. Missile targeting radars lit up. The civilian airliner had less than 2 minutes before it would be in range of 3 separate S-200 battalions. The intercept pilots, still trailing, received contradictory instructions. One channel ordered them to force the aircraft to land at Talagi Airfield. Another warned, "Do not engage without strategic command." The lead pilot made a judgment call. He accelerated ahead, tilted his wings, flashed his lights, and tried to signal a course change, basic visual cues every commercial pilot should recognize. The airliner didn't respond, not because it was hostile, but because its autopilot was still engaged. Inside the cockpit, the crew had already begun troubleshooting their navigational drift, but at that altitude, without external confirmation, they didn't realize how far they had wandered or how close they were to being shot down. At 10:58, the aircraft crossed the second strike boundary. Missile crews requested final confirmation to fire, and for 42 seconds, the line went silent. No word from Moscow. No engagement code. No authorization. Just a radar blip, a countdown, and a question. Are we about to kill 62 innocent people because of a heading error? Then, just as quietly as it had entered, the aircraft began to veer east toward a legal corridor, not because it was warned, but because the crew had finally noticed the compass drift. The radar team watched the blip slide out of the kill box. The MiGs broke off. The missiles never launched. But the Soviet system had come within seconds of vaporizing a civilian jet and had been paralyzed in the moment that mattered most. When the radar traces confirmed the civilian aircraft's exit from Zone 12B at 11:02 a.m., the immediate response from Moscow wasn't relief. It was disbelief. Reports filtered upward through PVO Northern Command and into the General Staff. Unidentified twin-engine aircraft deviated from international corridor. Visual confirmed as civilian. No engagement. To the Politburo, the situation was intolerable. Not because the aircraft had escaped, but because it had been allowed to. General Leonid Mashin, deputy head of air defense operations, was furious. Either we were tested and failed to respond, he barked, or we were paralyzed by indecision. Both are unacceptable. The problem, however, ran deeper than anger. The idea that a civilian aircraft could unintentionally violate a restricted zone went against everything Soviet command had built its defensive logic around. So Moscow rejected it. The incident was reclassified not as a navigational error, but as a potential foreign intelligence operation. Briefs were rewritten to describe the aircraft as unknown, possibly configured for electronic surveillance. KGB operatives were instructed to analyze the flight's origin, passenger list, and ownership structure for signs of covert affiliation. Meanwhile, a second wave of internal messaging circulated the radar failure theory. Commanders were told the aircraft had briefly appeared to deviate from its corridor due to sectoral misregistration, a mapping anomaly, a software bug, anything but the truth, because the truth was unacceptable. If the system couldn't tell a spy from a lost civilian, what good was it? If the doctrine didn't cover ambiguity, how could it protect the state? If a missile commander was forced to wait for Moscow in a situation that demanded real-time decision-making, how could war be won? Worse still, word of the incident had begun to spread inside the ranks. Radar crews were asking how close the order had come. Pilots were whispering about the plane that nearly died. And so, the cover-up began. Orders were issued to seal the tapes. Radar logs were edited. A formal debrief of the MiG-23 pilots was delayed for 2 weeks, long enough for their memories to be clarified by political officers. Publicly, the flight never entered restricted airspace. Privately, Soviet command knew better. They had stared down a moment where action was possible, but judgment was required, and for those 42 seconds of silence, they realized the system they had trusted for decades was incapable of making that call. It didn't matter that no one died, because Moscow's silence wasn't indecision. It was doctrinal collapse in real time. With the incident officially reframed as a possible foreign probe, Soviet intelligence services sprang into action not to find the truth, but to justify the mistake that had almost been made. The first theory, a deliberate NATO incursion disguised as a civilian aircraft. This narrative fit the moment. US RC-135 reconnaissance planes had previously mimicked civilian flight paths during border mapping operations. American doctrine encouraged testing Soviet reaction times flying close, baiting radar locks, studying escalation speed. So perhaps, they reasoned, this was one of those probes. The aircraft had entered airspace with no IFF the PVO could read. It maintained a calm, provocative trajectory, neither fleeing nor acknowledging interceptors. That kind of behavior, some in GRU intelligence argued, was consistent with masked surveillance operations. It wasn't the truth, but it was convenient, because it offered Soviet command something they desperately needed, a threat to point at, a reason the system froze, a justification for not firing, but also not admitting error. Soon, the theory made its way into internal intelligence bulletins. Charts appeared showing possible U.S. reconnaissance routes overlapping accidental civilian drifts. Photos of similar Boeing airframes were analyzed for antenna mounts. Entire profiles were created about the charter airline searching for Western intelligence links. None were found. But that didn't matter. By reframing the flight as a deliberate test, the Soviet system avoided having to confront the actual threat that it had nearly killed innocent civilians because its doctrine couldn't process a mistake. In one internal memo, a KGB analyst wrote, "Regardless of true intent, the aircraft's behavior matched a strategic deception profile. Therefore, response justification remains valid. It was a logical contortion, a lie told in the language of intelligence, and it stuck." Even officers who had watched the aircraft drift and return began to doubt what they saw. If it wasn't hostile, one later recalled, then why did they send 4 MiGs? The truth that a civilian plane got lost was too dangerous to accept. Because if a system built for war could be triggered by an airliner, what else could it misinterpret? And worse if it couldn't fire when doctrine said it should. What would happen in a real conflict? So they chose the wrong theory. They chose enemy action over system failure. And in doing so, they protected the system even if it meant lying to themselves. When the foreign incursion theory began to lose traction after no evidence of American involvement surfaced, Soviet analysts shifted to a second explanation: internal subversion. The logic was more paranoid, but in the USSR's tightly controlled security state, it felt just plausible enough to gain momentum. The theory claimed the aircraft had not entered the restricted zone by accident, nor by enemy design, but through internal collusion. Specifically, that someone within the Soviet aviation bureaucracy, air traffic control, or even the pilot crew had deliberately altered the flight path to provoke a response or test the system. This was the defector's sabotage hypothesis. KGB Internal Affairs launched a quiet investigation. The civilian airline's radio transcripts were seized. The pilot's past flight logs reviewed. Border records were checked for foreign contacts. Even weather reports were audited, in case the supposed autopilot drift could be disproven. Nothing stuck. The pilot had 9,000 flight hours. The co-pilot had once flown state officials. The airline had no ties to intelligence communities, foreign or domestic, and yet the theory persisted. Because like the foreign incursion theory, it served a purpose. It allowed the Soviet military to blame a person, not a principle. By positing a human betrayal, they could avoid confronting what truly happened, that the system designed to prevent catastrophe had no built-in mechanism for human error. The most disturbing conclusion, buried in an internal GRU summary, was never circulated beyond the top brass. It read, if the crew was not complicit and the aircraft was not hostile, then our system mistook a routine navigational event for a strategic incursion. That failure lies not in detection, but in interpretation. Interpretation was the weak link. The radar did its job. The interceptors launched. The missiles locked. The network responded. But when faced with a scenario outside the binary logic of Cold War doctrine attack, or not, the system froze, and because no one wanted to admit that the doctrine was flawed, they searched for sabotage. They imagined treason. They turned a mechanical drift into an ideological betrayal. They asked, who let this happen, but never? What in our system made this outcome inevitable? The second wrong theory allowed them to assign guilt, but it also guaranteed that the real lesson about the inflexibility of their own procedures would be buried, because as long as they could invent a villain, they could pretend the system still worked. By the time the full after-action review reached the Soviet General Staff, the truth was unavoidable, even if no one dared say it aloud. The aircraft hadn't been American. It hadn't been hijacked. And it certainly hadn't been an insider plot. It had been a simple navigational error, compounded by weather-induced autopilot drift and confirmed by black box data weeks later. The pilots had reoriented once they realized their heading was off. The entire deviation had lasted just under 16 minutes. But within those 16 minutes, the Soviet air defense system had gone from full readiness to near engagement, without ever truly understanding what it was responding to. This was not just a radar glitch. It was a systemic intelligence failure, baked into every level of the military's perception logic. To understand how internal investigators reconstructed the chain of decisions. First, the radar stations. They picked up the aircraft on time, tracked it with precision, and issued alerts appropriately. No fault. Second, the interceptor crews. They responded within 11 minutes. maintained distance, confirmed visual ID, followed standard procedures, no fault. Third, the command center. This was where failure struck. The Northern Theater Command issued a shadow and hold order at 10:51 a.m., based on the assumption the aircraft might be friendly. Meanwhile, Central Command in Moscow issued a standing threat level upgrade, treat all unidentifieds near Zone 12B as potential intrusions. But the worst lapse was communication. The two commands never synchronized. A message confirming the aircraft's likely civilian nature was sent from Regional Command at 10:56, but was routed through three separate encrypted lines. It didn't reach Moscow until 11:04 after the aircraft had already exited the danger zone. The result missile units were waiting for a launch code from a central authority that was still waiting for confirmation of what the target was. In other words, a perfect freeze. This wasn't just dangerous, it was damning. The PVO's intelligence model had no room for decentralized judgment. Missile operators weren't allowed to override. Pilots couldn't make decisions on target identity. Even base commanders were limited to shadowing, not intercepting, unless explicitly cleared. The intelligence failure wasn't in the data. It was in how the system interpreted it slowly, fearfully, bureaucratically. In American doctrine, NORAD worked closely with civilian aviation agencies, tracking transponders, verifying flight plans, and layering military response with FAA data. Soviet systems had no such integration. To them, a civilian blip looked just like a strategic threat until someone far away decided otherwise. The internal review's conclusion was chilling. We correctly identified an aircraft, but incorrectly interpreted its significance. The delay was not technical, it was cognitive. Our system awaits permission to think. No one was punished. No medals were given. Just a closed file. Filed under resolved no hostile action. But for those in the radar rooms that day, the real resolution was something far worse. The system had almost worked as designed, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. While Soviet command was scrambling to reinterpret what had just happened, halfway around the world, at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, a quiet analysis team at NORAD had already written their report. It concluded, in unclassified terms, no breach, no threat, standard airspace deviation, resolved by course correction. To the Americans, the incident was a non-event, a blip, a footnote. Why? Because the U.S. Air Defense Network had already tracked the same aircraft via civilian aviation systems. FAA radar had maintained visibility throughout its journey. The flight plan had been filed, the crew known, the tail number logged. American military radar saw the same drift, but unlike the Soviet system, it had context. It knew what the blip was. It didn't need to guess. This was the difference. The Soviet system depended on closed, hardened infrastructure. It saw the world through threats and responses. The American system, by contrast, was integrated civilian, military, satellite, airborne early warning, all feeding into one dynamic map at Eglin, Langley, and Elmendorf. Radar analysts weren't just technicians, they were interpreters. Their screens lit up with metadata aircraft model, transponder frequency, ATC handoff history. If an airliner drifted into sensitive space, they knew who was flying it, where it was coming from, and whether it had deviated before. In the Soviet Union, an unidentified blip meant danger. In the UE, it meant a call to the tower. This was more than a technological difference. It was a doctrinal chasm. U.S. doctrine trained its operators to identify anomalies, not just threats. A sudden altitude change didn't imply a missile. It might mean turbulence. A wrong heading wasn't sabotage. It might be a flight crew misreading a waypoint. Where Soviet command relied on vertical escalation, waiting for Moscow U.S. systems pushed decision-making down, FAA officers coordinated with NORAD. Civilian controllers could radio military airfields. Frontline analysts had permission to resolve without waiting for the Pentagon. That decentralization saved time and lives. When an Iranian airliner entered U.S. radar zones by accident in 1984, it was escorted, not targeted. The protocols assumed misunderstanding before hostility. In 1987, a civilian freight aircraft deviated over Alaska. Fighters were sent, but with strict no-fire rules, the plane was guided back to safety without incident. This mindset assumed confusion before conspiracy stood in stark contrast to the Soviet model of deny, distrust, destroy. And that made all the difference. American early warning systems weren't just tracking aircraft. They were tracking human error and baking it into their protocols. Because the U.S. knew that war wouldn't start with a missile. It would start with a misunderstanding, a signal misread, a pilot confused, a radar officer with the wrong assumption. So the system was built to bend without breaking. And when compared to a Soviet doctrine that could only freeze or fire, that flexibility was the true weapon. Not the radar, not the missiles, but the ability to know the difference between threat and mistake. No shots were fired, no wreckage burned, no headlines splashed across newspapers, and yet, within the closed doors of the Soviet General Staff, the event was treated as a defeat, a silent, humiliating battle lost not in the skies, but in the logic of command. For nearly half an hour, the most powerful integrated air defense system on Earth had tracked, targeted, and nearly eliminated a civilian aircraft without understanding what it was doing. The humiliation wasn't that they hesitated. It was that they didn't know whether or not they should. At the Voronezh radar facility, technicians were ordered to retroactively review every second of telemetry, down to the voltage readouts. No fault was found. Their machines had worked flawlessly. At the Olenia interceptor base, the MiG-23 crews were debriefed not on their flying, but on their restraint, why they hadn't forced the aircraft to land sooner, why they hadn't recognized a hostile profile, why they hadn't demanded permission to engage. One pilot reportedly responded, because it looked like a family on vacation. That was not the answer command wanted to hear. And in Moscow, senior planners were confronted with a deeper realization. American doctrine had anticipated this scenario and theirs had not. The USSR's decades-long obsession with centralized control had created a system that could respond rapidly to a known threat, but was helpless in the face of uncertainty. If the aircraft had been a B-52, the response would have been automatic. If it had fired a missile, the retaliation would have been instant. But because it was neither of those things, the system froze. This was where the humiliation came in. Not in failure of weapons, but in failure of doctrine. American air defense had no such freeze. NORAD analysts had watched the same aircraft and dismissed it in under 5 minutes. Their radars saw the deviation and knew it didn't matter. That kind of confidence couldn't be faked. It came from trust between civilian and military systems, between air traffic controllers and fighter pilots, between radar data and command instinct. Soviet command had none of that. Every piece of the system waited for permission from above. Every response was layered in caution, politics, and fear of error. The aircraft that day didn't penetrate Soviet airspace. It exposed it. It proved that all the strength in steel and speed meant nothing if the people at the controls couldn't make a decision without panicking. The irony, in the end. The American system won that encounter without ever lifting off the ground. It let the blip pass, confirmed it was a mistake, moved on, while the Soviets rewrote logs, falsified transcripts, and feared the very system they had built to defend themselves. The civilian aircraft was long gone. The pilots landed, filed a deviation report, and returned to routine. For them, it had been a technical hiccup, a navigation bug, a story to share over coffee. But for Soviet command, the incident left a fracture, one that reached deep into the ideology beneath their entire military architecture. For decades, the USSR had framed its air defense as the most advanced in the world, a vast, unbreachable shield of radar stations, interceptor squadrons, and surface-to-air missile nests, a deterrent so complete, so fast, so ironclad, that no foreign power could touch its skies without triggering a storm of retaliation. But that shield had cracked. Not from pressure, not from penetration, but from a question it could not answer. What if the intruder isn't a threat? The doctrine hadn't prepared for that. The radars couldn't distinguish intent. The people operating the system were trained to react, not to reason. In that sense, the system had revealed something terrifying. It could launch a missile in under 3 minutes, but it couldn't understand a mistake in under 30. And that wasn't just a tactical failure. It was an ideological one, because the Soviet military had always portrayed itself as rational, scientific, flawless. Its procedures were written with mathematical precision, its chain of command engineered for speed and power. There was no room for doubt, because doubt, in a closed system, equaled weakness. Yet the moment demanded doubt, it demanded human judgment, flexibility, communication, the very things Soviet doctrine had treated as threats to control. And so, rather than evolve, they buried the truth. The incident was never acknowledged in the press. The tapes were classified, the flight numbers scrubbed from logs, officers were rotated, reports rewritten, archives sealed. Officially, nothing had happened, but unofficially, every radar officer who had been on duty that day knew. They knew they had come within seconds of killing dozens of innocent people. They knew the system had failed them, and they knew that next time, they might not hesitate, because hesitation had not been rewarded. It had been erased, and that silence, more than any missile, more than any MiG, was the true signal of collapse. The Boeing 720's brief and nearly fatal deviation over northern Russia never made the history books. No wreckage, no confrontation, just a flight that wandered, and a defense system that couldn't decide whether to kill it or let it go. But within the Cold War's towering machinery of control, that moment left a ghost that haunted radar rooms and missile crews, that lingered in classified debriefs and training manuals, that whispered through every drill with a silent, shattering truth. A system built for instant retaliation may be the most dangerous when it hesitates, because hesitation, in the hands of a doctrine that sees ambiguity as defiance, is not a pause, it's a system crash. For decades, Soviet planners obsessed over American weapons, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, nuclear submarines. But in the end, what shook them most wasn't a weapon at all. It was a question that their doctrine couldn't answer. Is this target an enemy, or just lost? And in those seconds where radar screens blinked and fingers hovered over launch keys, the Cold War nearly turned hot, not by aggression, but by inflexibility. The aircraft turned, the crisis passed, but the lesson stayed buried. Until now. Because the Cold War wasn't just a contest of missiles. It was a test of systems, judgment, and the terrifying cost of being wrong. If you found this breakdown insightful, powerful, or just too close for comfort, subscribe to our channel now. Every week, we dig up forgotten, near misses, unsung moments, and chilling what-ifs from the Cold War's front lines. Turn on notifications, because next week's episode might reveal a moment where history came even closer to the edge